This is Into the Multiverse with Josh Peck.
Well, gene therapy might not be as therapeutic as we think it is. Welcome to Into the Multiverse. I'm Josh Peck, your host. We got a really cool interview for you today. But first, before we get to that, so this new animal study has raised some concerns about high-dose gene therapy. There has been this gene therapy trial that recently led to dramatic benefits, at first it seems, for babies born with a fatal neuromuscular condition, and that raised hopes for using a similar approach to treat other diseases. But a new animal study suggests that the high doses of gene-carrying viruses used in these treatments might not be as safe as the human clinical trial first indicated. So in the new research, the disclosure of which briefly set the stock prices of several gene therapists plummeting, researchers injected a handful of young monkeys and pigs with many copies of adreno-associated virus 9, or AAV9, which is normally a harmless virus that infects neurons and is increasingly being used to ferry therapeutic genes into cells to treat neuromuscular diseases. I just kind of laugh because some of the language of these articles is funny sometimes. It's normally harmless, but sometimes it's incredibly dangerous, and maybe we shouldn't be doing this, but maybe it's going to be okay. It's probably fine. A lot of these articles read that way. It's just, it's kind of silly. But so it says the results have garnered attention in part because they come from a lab of gene therapy researcher James Wilson at the University of Pennsylvania. Excuse me. Who led a 1999 trial in which a teenager died from an immune reaction to a gene therapy vector. So based on the latest animal results, Wilson is urging researchers planning to treat patients with high-dose AAV9 gene therapy to look for similar side effects. So despite that warning, he and others in the gene therapy field say that doesn't mean ongoing clinical trials with the gene carrier should be halted. This is a big deal, potentially, says Terence Folt, a gene therapy researcher at the University of Massachusetts School of Medicine in Worcester and editor-in-chief of Human Gene Therapy, which published the new study. Okay, that was a mouthful. That was a lot to get through. But he also writes in a commentary that the community should not overreact. Now, how often have we been told that? Don't overreact. I mean, you watch any commercial on like any kind of medication, and when it lists out the side effects, you can actually see them doing this. Next time you see one of these, and you see them all the time, but when you see an advertisement, you're watching TV and you see an advertisement for some kind of new medication or pills or something. When it lists out the side effects, pay attention to what's going on the screen. Every single time you have the man or the woman, they're playing frisbee, they're playing with a dog, they're outside, it's pretty, it's all these nice, wonderful things. They do that as like a psychological mechanism to try to convince you that it's okay. Like that's actually a process that they're doing it intentionally. That's not an accident. And it's mainly during the long list of side effects. And yet we're told not to overreact even in those situations. I mean, we have an opioid crisis in this country, but we're not supposed to overreact. It kind of goes down to this idea of transhumanism, which we've talked about on this show before. We've talked about many times on Skywatch TV and other areas, and I actually got a really cool interview that I'm excited to show you. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to progress scientific advancements and stuff like that. I'm all about restoration. For example, I've had a hip replacement myself because my hip was all messed up. I suffer from a rare degenerative bone disease I've talked about on this show and other shows before. So I had to have a hip replacement. Now, I don't have a like super hip where I can kick a football across 3 states or anything like that. It's just a replacement for the hip that I should have. It restored what should be there. Now, where I think there's danger is when we try to improve and when things like that don't happen naturally. Now, we like, for example, we know humans, we should have like 20/20 vision, let's say, but we shouldn't have lasers shooting out of our eyes. We talked about this in the biohacking episode. I mean, if you want to get stronger, you can lift weights, you could put in the work to do it, or you can biohack your genes and try to mess with your muscles that way. And I think there's a lot of danger in that. The reason is I'm all for if somebody wants to do something just to themselves, whatever. What business is it of mine? I can try to provide an argument to why they shouldn't, but ultimately that choice is up to him or her. If somebody wants to, let's say if somebody, like my good friend Zoltan Istvan, if he wants to put a chip in his hand, I'm not personally offended by it. I'm not really threatened by that because it doesn't have anything to do with me. Now, I might not think that's a great idea, and I might present reasons why I believe that, but ultimately it's his choice. He might think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm sure there are things that I'm involved in my life that he particularly wouldn't want to be involved with himself, like, Christianity or the church or, whatever. But that's his choice and it's my choice. So this isn't about forcing people to do things differently. The problem is when it comes to gene editing, now it's not exactly just a personal choice anymore. Now you're introducing something into the gene pool that's going to affect the rest of us. Say I want to keep my lineage just totally Homo sapien. Let's say that I want to do that. Well, if there are other people out in the world, other Homo superiors, that's what the H+ thing is all about in the transhumanist movement, where you edit your genes to better than human. Well, now my children don't have as much of a choice on keeping the lineage just pure human, just pure Homo sapien. Now, over time, and also there's nothing to say that would even have to be disclosed. I mean, there's some places in the country right now where you don't have to disclose to a sexual partner if you have AIDS, and you can just infect them. There's nothing to say that this would have to be disclosed. So there could be potentially the Homo superior species that would look just like Homo sapiens because they used to be Homo sapiens. Introducing their genes into the gene pool. Now that over time would spread out, and eventually you just don't have any say in the matter anymore. And what it also would eventually mean, in the darkest of scenarios, is you have an eradication of the Homo sapien species. So of course this goes beyond just a personal choice. If somebody wants to put a chip in their brain or whatever, I personally would suggest that they don't, but I don't want to create a situation where they're forced not to. I think that if we're standing on the truth, our arguments and our logic and reason should be powerful enough to a logical and reasoning thinking person. So some might wonder why even bother interviewing somebody like Zoltan, or why even bother having a transhumanist on the show? I mean, he's not a Christian. Isn't this a Christian show? Well, yes, but it's for it's for the Christian audience. So we know what the opposing argument is. We know how best to argue and defend against it, defend our own views. This is how we learn the best arguments for our own way of thinking. We listen to the opposition, and while we don't agree with their views, we listen to their best laid arguments, and then we can form our own best laid arguments, and then that's how you get at the truth of something. So I wanted to provide that for you guys, and it's actually the same reason that Tom Horn did in Human the way that he did. He let the transhumanists speak, he let them present their case, and then at the very end he provided his own analysis of it. And throughout this interview I'm about to show you, you'll hear some other points that I make, but keep in mind, Zoltan is not a Christian, and he's not on here to, I didn't invite him on to promote his way of thinking as if it's something that you should adopt at home. Clearly, that's not the case. The case is for you to understand the arguments that transhumanists will put out there so you know how best to defend against it if you're presented with those same arguments. How else are we going to know? So I wanted to do that for you guys. And also, Zoltan's, like I said, he's not a Christian, so he's going to say things that you're not going to agree with. He's going to say things that I certainly don't agree with. But I left the interview unedited. or I should say uncut. It's every video is edited to some point, but it's uncut, meaning I didn't take anything out that he said, even though some Christians might find it offensive. And the reason why is because he's not attacking Christianity, he's sharing his own beliefs. And in us knowing those beliefs, we have the best shot at crafting our own arguments against this stuff. It's important to have an open dialogue. And again, it just goes back to Inhuman, why Tom Horn, allowed the transhumanists to speak. If we know that we have the truth, and if we know that our way is the right way, we shouldn't be threatened by other people's points of view. We should actually listen to them. Not saying that we should adopt them, but we should listen to them so we know the best defense against those. Excuse me. So I just wanted to put that out there before I play you the interview. It is uncut. And again, you are going to hear things that you don't agree with. I heard things I don't agree with, but that's not to say that that's not to say that it's anything that we should be worried about or fear. Hearing an opposing view, especially to Christianity. I mean, this is our faith. How else are we supposed to provide an answer for the hope that's within us if we don't know what the arguments against it are? So I'm really hoping that this interview will help all of you out there. I'm hoping that it'll provide you tools that you will be able to then go out and defend the Christian faith against all this transhumanist stuff. And also there is a difference too. There's a lot of subtle differences within what we kind of have the blanket term transhumanism. For example, there are those out there who would define transhumanism as getting a hip replacement, like I have, so like I said in the interview, you'll get to hear that in just a second. There's a difference between restoration and glorification, and I think that's where the subtle difference is, but it is a major deal. So again, I hope that you will come away from the interview with maybe some new ideas on how to defend your faith, how to defend your Christianity, how to defend your walk with Christ against somebody who really, seems like all they want is for everybody to be happy and healthy. And I do believe that Zoltan fits in that category. I didn't get any kind of vibe from him that he's some kind of nefarious, guy with some hidden agenda or anything. But as I would assume he might believe I'm mistaken, I believe he is mistaken. And so I want to show you this interview and just kind of my thoughts about the interview. I think it went very well. I actually like Zoltan a lot. What's not to really like, except his worldview and all of his opinions on everything. But, I'm kidding, of course. But no, I like him fine as a person. There's no hostility in this interview. Now, we do have very different worldviews, very different opinions on things, and I let him speak, and I presented my own as well. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to find benefit in that, and maybe some of you out there have other opinions that I didn't address. Maybe you can think of some counter arguments that I didn't bring up, and maybe you wish I had. If so, put them in the comment section below, because I'm interested in this dialogue. I think it's important to not run away from a conversation, but to have these types of conversations so we know how best to frame our own arguments. If we understand what their motivations are, what their reasons are, that's how we best can defend our faith and explain to other people why we feel the way that we do. And in turn, as much as Christians are going to be watching this, there's going to be transhumanists that watch this interview as well. And, who knows, by having these conversations, maybe that will be enough to reach out to some people and to show them that Christians aren't all just anti-science and anti-medicine and some of these things. So anyway, all that being said, it's kind of a long-winded thing, but I just wanted to give you the reason why I wanted to do this interview and why I wanted to open up the conversation and why we have a transhumanist as a guest on Into the Multiverse. Again, we should not be afraid of these conversations. We should have these conversations so we know how best to frame our own arguments. So all that being said, here is the interview I conducted with Zoltan Istvan. Zoltan Istvan is an American transhumanist, journalist, entrepreneur, and libertarian futurist. Zoltan is the founder of the Transhumanist Party, the author of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, and a frequently interviewed expert on AI and genetic editing. Zoltan, I appreciate you coming on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Oh, great. Am I pronouncing your name right? I didn't know if it was Zoltan or Zoltan. I want to make sure that I get that right.
You're doing it correctly, and you can do it any way you like, honestly.
All right, good deal. For those who may not be familiar with you, and I want to give you a special thank you for being on the show. I'm sure it probably isn't always easy to come on a show where probably most of the audience fundamentally disagrees with a lot of things, but that's okay because we're friends and we're going to have a good, friendly conversation. I'm looking forward to it. But for those who might not be familiar with you, can you give us a brief history of your work and what you're doing today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of people don't know this, but I began my career at National Geographic as a journalist, and I was in a lot of conflict zones, saw a lot of difficult things. But I have always been somebody who's very interested in science and technology, and I wanted to use those things to try to overcome death because I am kind of a secular person who doesn't believe in an afterlife. And so the combination of a lot of the war zones, as well as being a science and technology advocate, has kind of propelled me to the forefront of this movement we call transhumanism, which is using, essentially science and technology to modify the human being and become much more than we are, with our number one goal being to overcome death. And just to make a long story short, I ran for president under the transhumanist banner. I'm now running for governor in California, again under the transhumanist banner, but this time I'm running as a libertarian. I have always believed in libertarian values. I just mix them with a lot of radical science and technology.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, there's something that we can agree on is the libertarian stuff. I don't know what I am. I hold some libertarian values. I don't know if I'm a full libertarian or not yet. I haven't quite decided, but I think you and I probably have a lot, of agreement there. And also, to start on something that we can agree on, and I think it's important to start with stuff we can agree on because, Skywatch TV and Tom Horn and me and some of the other people, Derek Gilbert, that work here, we've written a lot and done a lot of work, kind of speaking, well, giving another view, I guess, of the, would be the polite way to say it, of the transhumanist stuff. So, but I always found these kinds of conversations interesting. Actually, the interview you did with InfoWars was one of my favorites. I thought that was really cool. But I think something that we can probably agree on, because I've heard you talk about this in other interviews as well, artificial intelligence. Can you tell us about some of the potential hazards or dangers that you see, that you could see coming from AI?
Yeah, I hate to play the cliche, but the movie Terminator is a very realistic possibility of a machine intelligence going wrong and taking over, wanting to take over. And the problem with machine intelligence, it may not even know it is taking over because it's kind of programmed just to do these things. So I am one of those people that really love technology, and I believe we should put a lot of resources into developing AI. But the moment AI becomes smarter than human beings, I would want to 100% stop that.
Right.
Because I don't believe in inviting another species onto planet Earth, including AI, that's smarter than human beings. It just makes absolutely no sense. We can use it for driverless cars. We can use it to fly our airplanes and do our chores. Fine. But I don't want my robot in my house to be smarter than me at any point in the future. I just can't see myself change that unless I somehow merged with it. Now, and again, that's transhumanism, and that's where it becomes different. But an AI outside of myself, I'm worried about.
Yeah, me too. That was an interesting way to put it. That you don't want to invite something into the world that's smarter than humanity, and that I would agree with. And we'll touch more on that a little later too. But on the topic of AI, you sent me a story that you wrote called "The Jesus Singularity." Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, there's two concepts in the Jesus Singularity. The first is I wrote for HuffPost, just a nonfiction article about the concept. There are many Christians out there at this point that are Christian transhumanists, and they are trying to do things like convert artificial intelligence or robots to be believers. And, there is this question, can machine intelligence be saved? Even the Pope has said, if aliens come to Earth, we should try to save them. And it's sort of that same concept with an AI. Now, so the Jesus Singularity is this idea that there are engineers out there who are experts at developing AI, that might be interested in converting it into believing in Jesus. And of course, I wrote a short story that was a bit anti-religious and also anti this Jesus singularity, saying, what happens if machine intelligence takes the Bible completely literally and wants to, do away with certain types of people or make us into various slaves, or, there has to be some context when you read the Bible. I think a lot of people understand that, whether you're a believer or not. And so we must be careful that the vengeance of God is not put into a machine intelligence. And really, that's what the short story, The Jesus Singularity, is. Of course, like I said, I also did an article for HuffPost, just a nonfiction article on it.
Sure. Yeah, I read the story. I thought it was really interestingly written. And I kind of came away with it wondering is there a chance... And maybe I'm totally way off base, but I think I might be seeing something in the story that other people miss, and it would be really cool if I was. But maybe this is just way out in left field. Is it a satire of what some atheists might think of Christians? Because I found that some of the Christian, in the story, there's a president and he's a Christian. Some of his choices seem completely against actual Christian teaching, such as forcing religion rather than it being a choice, or removing free will, or acting out of emotional anger rather than logic. Was this a type of satire of how some atheists might view Christians?
Well, so to some extent, I'll admit there is some satire in it, but let us take a real, a look at the story, and just so your audience knows,
sure.
This was published in Vice and the short story did very well. It really talks about Mike Pence becoming vice president, going from vice president to the presidency. And if that was to happen, Mr. Pence holds, I would say, most people would agree, much stronger religious values than Mr. Trump does.
Sure.
And is probably a lot more of a crusader for Christian evangelism than Trump. And we are coming to an age when the most important national security issue is developing artificial intelligence and making sure that the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans don't get to it first. But when you come to this idea of creating an intelligence that's as important as human beings or as smart as us, virtually every single religious congressperson or politician out there tries to raise their children to be Christian, just like their beliefs are.
Sure.
Well, what's the difference between having an artificial intelligence in the same way? So it's very reasonable, and I've consulted with the United States Navy, it's very reasonable to think, well, yes, we would teach our AI religious values, and those religious values would be from a Judeo-Christian framework rather than, let's say, an Islamic framework or a Buddhist framework. And that makes perfect sense that the U.S. military would do that. I mean, after all, you're not talking about a robot. You're talking about something that's almost or as smart as human beings. So certainly you want to teach it about the Bible. Certainly you want to teach it context of what it means to live in a nation where every congressperson believes in God. So the real question is, if Mike Pence became president and let's say in 10 years, this was on his watch, would he have an executive order say, let us make this machine intelligence believe in Jesus rather than have it believe in Islam and start, doing jihads? And this is what the short story is about. There is some satire involved. I'm hoping we'll have, separation of state and religion, in our machine intelligences, but we might not. We might not if somebody like Mike Pence is president. And, that's really what that short story is about. And, of course, it goes wrong because I think teaching machine intelligence too much evangelical kind of passion could backfire because, after all, it is a machine. It may not have the kindness that a human mammal has.
So I'm curious, what about was there something that Mike Pence did or said that kind of inspired that? Because, coming from my own framework, if I was a programmer and I developed some kind of AI, I likely would just treat it. Well, really, religion would be the last thing that I'm thinking because it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have, But if I was thinking that, I would probably treat it as a human, which is, well, here's all the available information, here's all the religions, and I can give an argument on why I think Christianity is the one you should choose, but ultimately the choice is up to you. Is there something that Mike Pence has said or done that runs contrary to that?
Not necessarily, but what you really come down to is, look, like I said, you have to think of AI as sort of a child.
Sure.
If you have this empty slate, and this robot is starting to get smarter, you're growing up with it, it's been with you for a few years. Mike Pence, obviously through the government, would be funding the AI. He's in charge of the military. Trump, whoever would be president. you're going to have to ask yourself at some point, well, what do we program in for values? Because that's the central question with AI. Yes, we can make it so it can make very rational decisions, fly airplanes, drive cars, wash our dishes. But what happens when it comes to this point of, there's a family of 4 very young, or there's one old person, and then who do you accidentally kill if you have to kill one? I mean, game theory happens all the time, and this is how AI is being built. And these choices, while nobody likes to face them, this is ultimately how machine intelligence must be programmed, with decisions for this. And when you come to those decisions, a lot of our own personal decisions come from our historical backgrounds. And for many Americans, that's Christianity. That's the Bible. That's why people choose not to cheat on their spouse, or why somebody chooses to do a good thing for a neighbor, because they have these religious values. So I think it's very safe to say if Mike Pence raised his 3 kids to believe in God, he's certainly going to ask the military to give it at least a nudge towards being some kind of Christian framework in machine intelligence. And, that's I'm not saying that's good or bad. Of course, I would prefer it to be completely a secular-minded machine, but I'm not president. He might be.
So if it was instilled with Christian values, like in the story, how does that lead to the destruction of the world, which is a completely anti-Christian thing to do?
Well, I think what happens here is, first off, you're talking about the infallibility of humans to program something, and we all know from just looking at our own worlds how many wars we've been in, how many tragic things happen per day. Humans are fallible. I mean, we can make all sorts of mistakes, and we're certainly going to make mistakes with the very first machine intelligences that we try to program. And I think, ultimately, nobody has had at least nobody that I've ever met has had the spirituality, the strength, the love of, let's say, what I know to be historical Jesus Christ.
Sure.
And if you can't you have to understand, if someone came to me and said, look, I'm going to program this machine to be just like Jesus, I would take a very different stance backwards and say, wow, this is going to be a really nice machine. But if somebody came and said, we're going to do our best, and that person maybe is going through divorce, or, he's had problems in his childhood, and there's a bunch of engineers, some are alcoholics, some are drug, you have to understand, we are, as a human beings, we're fallible.
Sure.
And we're going to put those same ethics and values into a machine, which then might have access to nuclear codes. That is the scenario of Terminator. This is a very dangerous moment in history where we must make sure we can be humble enough to say we don't have that much intelligence to control a machine ourselves to let it run wild. Maybe we can be right next to it. In fact, I've said this before, in 20 years, we're going to have artificial intelligence presidents. But I don't know if those will be only robots. They might be like a robot with a human being right next to it, constantly monitoring it and going back and forth. This actually is a very good way of actually, I think, running governments, because you'd have algorithms that could be more beneficial to the greater good of the people. But the reality is, just letting a machine intelligence run free with values that we think are Christian, they could very quickly turn. And that's what happens in that short story is it talks about, the Bible is filled with war and all these other, very, I would say, to my mind, somewhat crazy things that happen. And if it's just the gospel, it's one thing, but we're not talking. The Bible is much more than the gospel. It includes Revelations, includes the end of the world. These are things we have to be very careful when you teach a machine intelligence about. It may interpret them wrong. And that's what happens in that short story.
So it sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it's more of an issue or more of a danger within the human fallibility problem, that humans are programming it rather than a problem with the Christian values themselves. Is that correct?
Well, yes, because, I actually subscribe to a huge amount of Christian values. I think anyone does. I think for me, the golden rule is one of the most beautiful and important rules you can know. Basically, if we all followed the golden rule, the world would be very different. Where a lot of Christianity gets lost to me, and I was raised a Catholic, is in the idiosyncrasies or the nuances of it, where people do bad things and justify things, or all of a sudden you can say no to gay rights, or a woman doesn't have control of her body. These are all, now you're getting into the nitty-gritty of where Christianity meets social culture. But when you talk about just the actual values of Jesus Christ, we're talking about someone who's wonderful, who wants to help the poor, who wants to dedicate his life to other people. This is very different. If we were all like this, then I would have a very different interpretation of putting these ideas into machine intelligence. But like I said, look outside your window. Humans do some very bad things. We're always at war. I read a statistic said something said like 78 of the last 100 years, America's been at war. I mean, these are not things I think Jesus would have done. So it's not safe. We can say we aspire for those values of kindness and love to one another, but we're not doing a very good job, and we certainly haven't over this last 100 years.
Well, I can definitely agree with that. To kind of switch gears, you said in other interviews, and I don't know if you still hold to this title or not, but that you're a democratic libertarian. Is that an accurate title for yourself?
It is. I almost never go with that anymore because as soon as the libertarians hear the word democratic, they freak out. So now I usually just say I'm a left-leaning libertarian, and I'm not very hard to the left. I'm pretty in line with Gary Johnson. The only difference is that I support a version of a universal basic income. But other than that, I'm pretty straight in line with a lot of Gary Johnson, who was the Libertarian presidential candidate's his values.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, the reason I ask is because the term itself, it sort of sounds like, people should be able to do what they want, libertarian, but the government should pay for it, democratic. Is that mistaken?
Yes,
Okay.
100%. I'm actually pretty strongly against government paying for almost anything, except basically minarchist values, like I think police, fire department, military, court systems. Yes, we need those things, and we should allow the government to do those things. But when it comes to other things, I'm dramatically of the mindset that we should get rid of huge amount of social services,
yes,
a huge amount of the kind of security blanket that is making people, I think, in my opinion, quite lazy across America. Yep. And I actually, because a lot of people say, oh, well, you support a universal basic income, so you got to be really leftist. But that's not it. I have this plan called a federal land dividend, and this is a libertarian version of a universal basic income. Basically, it says, America is holding $180 trillion of empty federal land, a lot of which could be leased out or sold to private parties and businesses, which could then start funding a lot of the social services that you and I are actually taxed for. And the thing is, you have to think Nevada's 96% empty. It has almost the same mineral resources as Afghanistan, and yet we're not fighting a war in Nevada. Why don't we use those resources? And that's how I would pay for food stamps. That's how I would pay for, different types of benefits. No, I wouldn't want food stamps. I want just everyone gets a straight check. You use it or lose it. But through these $180 trillion, we could entirely do away with Social Security, do away with most of the social services out there, and provide everybody, and I don't mean just the poor people. I want you to understand, I want that check too. Provide people around, $1,500, $1,700 a month income. And that's how I would ensure a libertarian society that also uses its natural resources to help those that might not be better off. And the reason I mention a lot of this and the reason I have this program is because we are facing an AI future. Going back to AI, robots will take jobs. Truckers are going to lose their jobs. Taxi drivers are going to lose their jobs. Lawyers are already starting to lose their jobs. I mean, all around the world, every industry that you know of is going to be challenged by robots and AI. So at some point we need something or there'll be a revolution.
In a world with and I agree with a lot of the rolling back on the social programs and stuff like that. I am all for getting rid of that stuff, and especially not forcing the taxpayer to pay for it. So my question would be, in a universal where everybody gets a universal basic pay, would that promote competition and advancement and stuff like that? If everybody kind of knew they were going to get paid the same either way, would that then incentivize people to kind of fall back into the same laziness as like welfare and stuff like that is now?
Well, it's interesting. The very few programs and studies that have been out there have actually shown, completely contradictory to what many people think, it does increase in competitiveness. What happens is, once you put a floor under people, like this basic income is just going to give you enough for food, enough for maybe healthcare, and enough for shelter and the basics. It's not a life that you're going to necessarily be able to, do things you want on. And this is where your own ingenuity and your own innovativeness can come. And what's great about it, if you want to be a journalist, but you don't really have enough funds to make it a year when you're not making it as a freelancer, or if you want to be an artist, or if you want to start a business, this will give you that floor. So a lot of people think actually this kind of universal basic income, and again, I call it a federal land dividend because my universal basic income does not raise taxes whatsoever. I am not raising taxes to pay for this. This is simply just going to cut up federal land and start leasing or selling it out to people, big businesses, who would then pay the people money to, because, this is land that belongs to Americans. It belongs to you and I. If you split America by 325 million people, that federal land out there, every single American alive today would have about a $500,000 net worth. So we're just trying to monetize that. And I think it would actually make people more competitive over the long run, perhaps more creative, especially as, more and more jobs get taken. We're going to find ourselves a kind of society that has different types of ways of earning income because, doing it the traditional way, driving trucks or serving food at McDonald's, those will be replaced in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. As a transhumanist, what are your personal main goals? What would you like to see in the world and with humanity?
Well, and I'll just tell your audience, just so people know, the number one goal of transhumanists, and one of the main reasons they're in it, in this movement, is really to overcome death with science and technology. That's really their biggest goal. And in the last 18 months, I have seen the amount of money going into transhumanism, not doubling or tripling, but going up 1,000% at this point in 18 months. It is amazing now the amount of resources just by billionaires, by startups, by venture capital companies going into this idea that we can stop aging. We can overcome most cases of biological death. Yes, you won't be able to overcome it if you're in a terrible car accident and smashed to bits. But we will overcome cancer, or we will be able to mitigate it enough to live with it. We will replace hearts with bionic hearts and overcome heart disease. A third of everybody dies from heart disease. So these are ways that transhumanism is trying to overcome death. And that is the single largest goal of the movement. And it personally is of mine as well.
Well, I'll tell you.
And this is where we have this is where we have this central kind of conflict between Christianity and transhumanism, is that most Christians aren't worried about dying because that's when they actually get to go meet their maker and live in a potentially a much better place than Earth. Whereas transhumanists like myself don't believe in that afterlife. We believe, and this is where my novel comes in, The Transhumanist Wager, we must make a wager to use science and technology to live indefinitely. And so that's why we're spending our resources, our energy, our businesses, our money, dedicating our lives to using science to overcome biological death.
Yeah, the way I see it, I don't think the conflict is actually so much in that, because a lot of what you were saying I actually agree with. I mean, a world without cancer would be great, and I think that medical technology should be able to do anything it can do to restore what's already there. I think where Christians kind of get their jumping off point is when it turns into turning humans into something else, into something better, into something, to use a Christian term, glorified. And I think that's kind of more in line with because like I, for example, would be the biggest hypocrite in the world if I said, if you have a disease, you shouldn't use science and technology to correct that disease because God gave you that disease for a reason. I actually I have a degenerative bone disease, and I've had a hip replacement for it. And actually around the office, Skywatch and everyone jokes around that I'm Skywatch's first transhumanist because of the hip replacement. Obviously, that's not really transhumanism, but so I absolutely see the value in using medical technology, and I think a lot of Christians do to restore the human body to the health that it naturally should be in. I think more of the conflict is in the glorification aspect or in the improving, and I do want to get to that. Beforehand, though, to meet these goals, just practically, I mean, I kind of got a sense on how you would probably want to pay for it. But how do you think the country or even the world is going to pay for this? Do you think that it would be more like government programs or privatized companies? How do you see it playing out?
Well, I hope that it would be private company. However, a main point of my campaign is that I think if we are spending, so right now we spend 20% of the federal budget on the military and just about 2% on science and technology. And of that 2%, we spend less than 0.01% on any kind of life-extending technologies or whatnot. I have suggested that instead of spending you can't just stop spending money on the military so dramatically because we would go into a recession or a depression like this country has never seen. we are now this military-industrial complex, as sad as it is, and I am very against wars, against foreign wars. I want to downsize the military significantly. This has always been a big policy of mine. But I think the people that run the military and those companies can make just as much money in radical medicine and radical technologies that actually, we have a war going on. We have a war against heart disease. We have a war against diabetes. We have a war against Alzheimer's. And yet we're fighting in Afghanistan. I mean, it makes no sense to me. Let's come home and fight the things that matter to us, our children, to our parents, and those kinds of things. So I say fight those wars at home. And if we're going to have to dedicate money, let us dedicate money to, instead of a military-industrial complex, a science-industrial complex. Now, I still want to lessen the money. I still want to have a lot smaller of a government, and I would make those kinds of jumps towards that. But I realize that at this point, America is so stuck in one single way, you must be very careful to not upset the economy. But we can transition from a military-industrial complex to something of a science or a healthcare industrial complex. And I don't mean healthcare like, everyone gets their own. I mean like replacing body parts so that we can live longer. And just to go back, I don't fundamentally believe that we actually have a real problem between Christian ideology and transhumanist ideology. You're right. I think if God was here, he would be, he or she would be saying, let us make humans as healthy, as strong as possible. I mean, can't imagine God wants us to die. So I think if you have a bionic heart, it's not replacing your brain. It's not replacing anything else. If it has your child's dying because of heart disease, of course, I think a loving God would want these things. So I think actually transhumanism ideology are very compatible with Christianity. It's really just a matter of we have to be gentle because we are entering such radical times that we're moving so quickly. It's kind of scary for everybody. But ultimately, we'll probably become cyborgs, and might even become closer to God, those who are religious, that way through the different things. Now, again, I know it becomes a conflict when you talk about converting, let's say, machines into believers. Is that even human anymore? And that's, I understand, where most Christians draw the line. But most transhumanists aren't really ready to do that. Most transhumanists are like me, where I want bionic organs so I don't fail, so I can run a marathon, And, my dad died of heart disease last year. He had his 5th heart attack. These are the kinds of things we all would like to preserve in our loved ones. And that's really the core of transhumanist technology. It's not against going against Christian ideology. It's really about just making humans live as long as possible and be happy.
Yeah, and I agree with most of that. Well, because there are aspects of it that I don't think ever can be compatible with Christianity. Really nothing of what you just said, because, and I'm sorry to hear about your dad. My mom died of congestive heart failure a few years back. And believe me, if I could have given her a bionic heart so she would, live through that, I would. Because again, I have a hip replacement. It's not bone, it's metal. And so I don't see any problem there, because it's restoring something, or it's making the best out of a really bad situation, and it's not altering, like you said with the brain thing, it's not altering what it means for the person receiving it to be human. They're still human. So some of the differences. Well, actually, let me ask this. So in a transhumanist world, what happens? Let's say there's Christians that don't want to participate, or if there are people who, for whatever reason, they just don't want to. In an increasingly transhumanist world, how would they survive? How would they continue?
Well, as a libertarian, I certainly wouldn't force any of this on anyone. Everyone has a choice to do exactly what they want to do. And I assume that there are going to be enclaves all around the world of people that say, I don't want to be upgraded. I don't want to be improved. I don't want your radical science. Some people already do this with vaccines. We can kind of go back and forth on whether it's beneficial or not. I think they are. But I also understand that some people have the right to just say no, and we're going to come to that point when it's sort of like, if you work in the corporate world and you're not on social media, you might not be able to get a job anymore, because being in the corporate world requires that. It also sometimes requires having a car just to get to work. And I think this is kind of a good, simple example of what, my neighbor, he's in construction, I'm in construction. We both put on robotic arms, but his is 10 times better, and he's twice as efficient as I am. Well, he's going to be getting all the jobs. We're going to have to probably adapt, as we've always had to adapt to science to keep competitive. But I absolutely support people's rights to not adapt, and I think we should always respect those rights and go out of our way to make sure that people that want to be left alone are left alone.
Awesome. Yeah, I can definitely agree with you there. And you know, that's actually something that's a value that Christians hold too. If somebody doesn't want to be saved or they don't want to accept Jesus, it's actually kind of frowned upon if we go and badger. Now, there are Christians that will badger people and they shouldn't do it. But you know, in the general Christian community, it's frowned upon if a Christian's badgering somebody and saying, you need to accept Jesus or you're going to hell, and if they won't leave the person alone, you know. So I definitely understand where you're coming from there. I've heard transhumanism described as man, in a sense, taking control of his own evolution. If evolution is a true natural process, why would that be a good idea for us to alter what would be a natural course? Could that lead to massive problems down the line?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to tell you yes. And this is going back to our AI. A lot of people don't think of AI as just some, it's a tool we created. AI is a creation of evolution, and if AI ends up eradicating the human race, then we have been the instigators and the creators of our own demise. So technology is neutral, but the way humans implement it can be very negative or very positive. So that said, now that was kind of the negative thing. The positive on the transhumanism side is we can also make it so we don't have to suffer. We can make it so we don't have to lose a child to leukemia. We can make it so that our parents can be in good health again and don't have to be in wheelchairs. We can make it so that all of us live a really wonderful life for perhaps hundreds and hundreds of years. And in no way does it conflict with the idea that someday you're going to die, because you might still want to die, or you still might die through some type of new age mechanism, whatever. And still then be able to meet your maker. I think when we look at transhumanism, don't look at it in terms of this crazy idea of just completely becoming robots and becoming something completely else. It could be that we just learn to perfect our biology and live hundreds and hundreds of years, and maybe one day actually become the society that Jesus wanted us to be, of people who are really loving to one another, kind with one another. Maybe it's technology that actually says, hey, Zoltan, don't steal that thing, or don't do that bad thing, or don't, maybe it's technology that actually enables us to get to the true, ideals of Jesus. And I've said this before, I think people don't understand, like through virtual reality, through different types of even implants in your brain that control you being mean or doing criminal things, we can make ourselves a lot better human beings, not just for, religious reasons, of course, but for society, so that we actually are better people. But, then you get into this idea, like, who are you? Are you being too controlled by the technology? Well, I mean, right now, look, we're doing a newscast on technology. So this is our medium. Maybe technology shouldn't be seen as something so outworldly or something so unnatural. Technology might be just an extension of ourselves. And I think as we start to see it that way, then all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense, both in a Christian ideological way, as well as just a way that of humanity. Like, we care about people. We don't want them to suffer, to starve to death, to die, to go to war. We want people to have prosperous lives. And I think that's really the transhumanist age can bring us, done properly. But we must be careful that AI or Terminators don't destroy us, or we become complete weird cyborg things that are evil and only the rich have access to that technology and the poor live as, in some kind of dystopia. We must be very, very, very careful.
Yeah. Yeah, many Christians, myself included, would probably assume that if transhumanism or science and technology, which, by the way, I host a show called Into the Multiverse, so I'm definitely not anti-science. Most Christians aren't. But if that was going to be a way to get closer to God, like as you suggested, I think Jesus would have steered us towards those areas. And Jesus, the historical Jesus, or Jesus as a Son of God, didn't. It was more about values, getting to know God in your own personal way. So I think there's probably a bit of a disagreement there, but I see where you're coming from. There's an effort through gene editing, talking about making ourselves better, for Homo sapiens to become Homo superior, or I think there was another term, Homo futurist or something. If that occurs, would would this mean the eventual eradication of the entire Homo sapiens species? If you get more and more Homo sapiens upgrading to Homo superior, and then you have these two different species, wouldn't one just overtake the other?
I think that will likely happen. I think that has been happening, if you believe in evolution, for a long time, as the different types of humans that were out there and primates, one sort of evolved. And they didn't necessarily eradicate all the others, but only one evolved to a certain point. And there'll probably always be humans somewhere. But the amount of new types of species, and again, I would be very surprised if we remain in kind of a biological form as we are now, especially with the microprocessor evolving so quickly. It's very possible within 20 years, the microprocessor will be 1 million times smarter. And if we have, Elon Musk and other people have companies out there right now working on brain implants, if we can tap into that intelligence and go there, we may not need necessarily our physical forms. This is where it gets really spacey and, of course, science fiction-y, but it's all here. There's hundreds of millions of dollars pouring into Silicon Valley, where I essentially live, into these kinds of things. And I think, yes, at some point, you will have to make a choice. And that choice will be, do you remain who you are as just this biological, human, or do you become a real transhuman entity? And that transhuman entity is not just through genetic editing, though I think genetic editing is such an amazing technology. The real technology is in the microprocessor. It's in translating brain waves into machine interface and having your brain have complete access to the cloud, being one and the same with it. And that's, organized artificial intelligence. And that's, it's different than AI because we now become the AI. And I think that's really where a lot of the future is. And I have this conversation with my wife, who's a medical doctor, and, she says, well, should we save up for college for my two young kids? I have a 3-year-old and 7-year-old. And the truth is, we may, based on the amount of the trajectory of these companies, be able to start downloading, almost like the Matrix, information, calculus skills, geometry skills, playing Mozart's Fifth Symphony on the piano within 15 or 20 years, and certainly within 30 years. So there's a very strong chance that a lot of the ideas we have now may not even apply in 30 years based on how fast technology is improving. So I'm not sure if humans are going to make it, and I'm not sure if they really want to. Again, though, this doesn't mean that religion won't make it. People might still believe in Jesus way after they upload their consciousness to machines. And this is what the Jesus singularity is really about, is this idea of how far can you go? I know my short story was a negative kind of religious piece, but the actual article and the other things I've said about the Jesus singularity is this idea that a transformation technology could be centered entirely around Christianity. And that's, you have an implant that allows you to love God more, to love your neighbors more, to love the things in life. Like I said, Jesus isn't just some idea that only human brains can have. We might be able to, fabricate in such a way that people become much holier than they've ever been. And this could be, I've said before, the Holy Ghost could be software, could be code. And maybe it's a matter of people such as yourself understanding that and saying, well, this is a way to get closer to Jesus. I know that's far-fetched, but this is really where some of the Christian transhumanists are going.
Well, yeah, just to reiterate kind of the point from earlier, I highly doubt Christianity as a whole will get on board with that, because, the idea that we would need a chip in our brain to love God more, it's just not the way that Jesus taught how to love God. Now, I do want to get into the idea of uploading consciousness and stuff, because I find that really interesting. Before we do, though, just to close out the gene editing stuff, there are, like I mentioned at the top of the interview, there's quite a few libertarian views that I hold as well. So, I believe that anyone should be allowed basically to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else or get in the way of anybody else's rights. And, that's kind of the basics of it. And now on top of that, being a Christian, I also believe that there are things that I should not do to my own body. However, also as a Christian, I wouldn't force anybody to adopt that belief system. And I've never actually met a Christian who who would. Now, while I personally wouldn't say like put a chip in my hand or a chip in my brain or something like that, I also wouldn't try to force you or somebody else not to, but I would instead try to lay out, my best argument to convince you or somebody else towards my way of thinking, while realizing that, choice is still ultimately yours. Now, this view is actually ingrained in Christian teaching, and in line with that, not forcing somebody to do something or to become something that they don't want to become. The more people that edit their genes and become Homo superior, if that's the way that future plays out, the less the gene pool is actually Homo sapien. This would greatly reduce the choice of Homo sapiens to keep the Homo sapien species going in generations to come. And, it's not a natural evolutionary thing, because, again, this is something that is directed in a conscious effort from other people. And really, it would only take one generation to alter the gene pool in such a way that, who knows if it could be recovered. Now, how is that not forcing humanity to become Homo superior if in the future there are few or no Homo sapiens left to procreate with?
Well, again, it's not really forcing. What people are doing is saying that we have an opportunity here to eradicate disease, make ourselves stronger, improve ourselves so that we suffer less. And every generation improves upon that. But you have to understand, there's no more next generation or third generation, as I kind of explained with my daughters. There's no medical school. My wife's a doctor, and she wants my two daughters to go to medical school. That's never going to happen. There are going to be no doctors in 20 years because robots, or at least in 25 or 30 years, because robots will be so much more successful at practicing medicine. And so everything in society is going to change. So it's very difficult to talk about in terms of generations. But I still think the question philosophically is very important today, in this idea that it's okay to use technological or scientific manipulation to make the human much stronger, with the understanding that others will be left behind if they don't choose to use it. All through society and through history, that's been happening. The first primate picked up an axe and became something more superior than a primate. The others who didn't pick up axes, they couldn't forage for food as well. They couldn't cut their food. They couldn't use it to war and be better. I mean, these are the kinds of things that through history have happened. And genetic editing is just the latest and most important technology that we get our hands on that can make ourselves better. And, we have people that are working on having a third or a fourth arm. They want to put eyes in the back of their head. They want to make their legs, a foot longer so they can run faster. And, if they want those things, I think they should be able to do them, because it makes them more competitive both in the workplace and for whatever reasons they want. As a libertarian, I support that. And I think, that is very radical for most people who think that the sanctity, the temple, I know I've, read the Bible, Christ made the human body, and that's a temple. You're not supposed to alter it. And that's really where the conflict of transhumanism is yes, we can improve ourselves, but, for many Christians, improving means actually changing that temple. And I think everyone's going to have to make their own choice about what is a real change and what God would have wanted.
Well, I agree with you there. It's something that people will have to make their own choice about. And yeah, I would say that that's accurate, that, the Christian view is that your body is a temple. And again, it's a personal thing, not something that I would be willing to force on anybody else to adopt, my ideas about it or my interpretation about it. But, just in the sense that, a lot of Christians feel, as do I, that Christ died for humanity, and to become something else you might run the risk of not being included in that salvation, for humanity. So I think that's where a lot of Christians kind of have take issue with it, and as do I. Now, getting back to the uploading consciousness, I find this interesting, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the idea that we could possibly someday upload our consciousness to a computer or a cloud. And I've wondered this: how would we actually know that it's the real consciousness that's being uploaded and not like just a copy of it? The movie Transcendence actually got into this a little bit, but if it's a copy, for one thing, how would we know? But wouldn't people just essentially be killing themselves for a hope in uploading into an immoral environment when it might not really be them? It might just be a copy of their brainwaves or however it's going to play out.
Well, I mean, how can you prove you're not a copy right now? I did my senior thesis in a university in Columbia University on brains in a vat.
Right.
And the end of the senior thesis was that I couldn't prove, and no one has successfully ever been able to prove that we are not brains in a vat being manipulated right now.
Yeah.
And so, when you talk about copies of yourself, a lot of people say, well, it's not me. And I'm like, yes, it's probably not me, but if it's an exact copy of me, it's going to think it's me. And frankly, I rather have an exact copy of me, and then the person here says, well, there's an exact copy, at least it's something. It's kind of like having a child. If you're going to die, you're like, well, at least I have this offspring that's mostly me. And in this case, it's going to be almost a clone of you, a perfect clone. Of course, within a few seconds, it already has a different historical path. And then very quickly, within a day, it can become somebody very different. But I don't think we'll ever be able to prove that, but that's okay. I mean, a lot of people believe things that most people cannot prove that God exists, and yet they'll dedicate their life to it.
Sure.
And I think the same thing. I might, say, I'm not sure if that's me, but I'm glad it exists, as long as it's being nice to me.
It's an interesting take. Yeah, I always found that really interesting, and I like the philosophical conversation of how do you know that you weren't created 5 seconds ago with all the memories from your past, that they're just fabricated memories. I always those thought experiments are really interesting to me because you're right, you can't prove it. Now, going along with that, I got one more question for you. Going along with that idea, now I've often wondered, and I think most honest Christians would admit that they've wondered this too, what it would take for me to not be a Christian anymore and to embrace atheism. I've thought about that before, and again, every Christian has, whether they're willing to admit it or not. But for me, someone would have to convince me that through logic and reason, that the Bible's false, that Jesus never died and rose from the dead, and even the idea of a creator is impossible. And at least, to this date, no one's ever done that. But for me, and that's an age-old question going back thousands of years at least, but for me, that's what it would take. So for my last question, I wanted to pose a similar question to you. What would it take for you, just hypothetically, to abandon atheism and transhumanism and become a Christian?
Yeah, Jesus walking in my door right now, putting my finger through his hand. That would do it.
That would do it?
That would do it. And I wish that had happened. I've been raised a Catholic. I read the entire Bible cover to cover. It took me 27 days. I liked the idea that there would be a Jesus on planet Earth. It was very helpful to me to think that, because that would justify a lot of the terrible things that have always happened. I could say, well, somebody's in charge. Somebody's got it covered. And, I'm one of those guys that really wants there to be a God. And, even though I perhaps say I'm an atheist, I'm really an agnostic, someone who doesn't know, someone who's trying to know, someone who tries to understand as many things as possible and says, well, maybe, there is God. In fact, I'm the creator, if you don't know, of theocidism, which is this idea that God existed, but God chose to essentially end its life, or at least merge its existence into non-values in order so that free will would exist, because the idea of God knowing everything that's ever happened to all of us is kind of anti-libertarianism. And so I've always wondered, well, if God's God, how does it know everything that's ever going to happen? But maybe what God had done is, left the universe and left it just to run itself, and all of us have free will, and we all striving to be sort of like it. And, in fact, try to, mirror your life like Jesus would. And I think that's kind of a wonderful idea. But I am the creator of that idea, theocidism, which I wrote about. And it's still my philosophical belief that I'm hoping that maybe a God is out there, but I just have zero proof. So right now I'm kind of in the hugely agnostic camp saying, these are all the reasons against it. But yeah, if he walked in my door, put his hand right here, and I put my finger through it, I would be a believer.
Well, he just might do that. And actually, that's an important question too that a lot of people have is if God knows everything, then how does that affect free will? If God knows what I'm going to do before I do it, am I really free to make that choice? And Calvinists have their interpretation. A lot of different Christian camps have their interpretation of it. My personal one, my personal belief is knowledge doesn't really enact force. Like for example, if I knew that you were going to go to work today. And I knew it because you've done it, or you've done it every day. That doesn't get in the way of your choice to do it. You could stay home, and then it would just be something different. Now, the way that I see it with God is obviously He's all knowing, He's omnipotent, He's all these things. I don't have access to what He knows. So while He might know all the choices that I make, I don't have access to that knowledge. So I don't see how I could be locked in to any way of going just because he knows it, if that makes sense. That's just kind of my own personal take, but I just wanted to add that. And I appreciate you giving your take on it too. I can definitely understand where you're coming from. So where can people, if people want to find out more about you, your work, your campaign for governor, where can people go?
Well, sure. I think the first thing is, if you want to find about my work, read my novel, The Transhumanist Wager, because it is a classic book between Christianity versus transhumanism, and it's been compared over to Atlas Shrugged and Rand's work over 1,000 times, been covered in major media. So it's a really good introduction to transhumanism, as well as some of the ideological differences between Christianity and transhumanism. If you want to find out about my governor campaign, go to zoltanistvan.com. And, one thing we haven't talked about the show, but I'll just say very quickly is I am a very firm believer in protection of religious rights as a libertarian. So even if I am someone who's secular, you can rest assured that I'm going to be protecting your rights to have beliefs. I mean, I just think everyone needs to be able to have the right to do whatever they want to do. Well,
I'm really happy that we had this conversation, and I hope that this can help people out there. Not necessarily ascribe to one view or another, not become Christian or become transhumanist, but just to show that just because there's a fundamental disagreement in belief systems or worldviews, that doesn't mean that two people can't just sit down and have a good conversation about those.
Oh, no, of course. This has been a great conversation. I'm really excited. I'm thinking your audience might have a bunch of new ideas to kind of follow and see where the rabbit hole goes.
Well, I certainly hope so. And as always, I will be presenting this interview unedited. Well, I mean, there's going to be edit, but I mean, I'm not going to take anything out or remove anything that you said or that I said. But I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, and I hope that we can do this again. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I hope so too. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. All right, a big thanks goes out to Zoltan for the interview. Now, again, like I said, of course, there are things in there that I don't agree with, and there are things in there that you don't agree with, and I'm not saying that you should. But it's good that we have these types of conversations and that we don't fear somebody else's opinion, even if it conflicts with our own, even if it runs directly contrary to our own faith. Because, again, how else are we supposed to defend our faith if we don't know what arguments we're defending against? So I'm really hoping that interview can help the Christians out there who watch it maybe get a sense of some better arguments that maybe you come up with, or maybe you adopt some of the ones that I brought up during the interview. I'm hoping that helps in those regards. And to the transhumanist audience who might be watching the show and who might have a different view of Christianity, I hope that this opens some eyes in understanding where Christians come from in all this. It's not all just because, well, Jesus doesn't like it, so we don't like it. It's not, that's a really simplistic way of looking at it, and I'm not saying that all transhumanists view Christians that way, but it's a lot more than that. So I'm hoping that through that conversation, through that interview, while again there were lots of things that were said that I don't agree with, but that doesn't mean that we have to be offended by them. That doesn't mean we have to take a personal offense to somebody else's opinion. Everybody's life leads them in a certain direction, in a certain way, towards a certain set of values or opinions. So if we truly believe that our way of looking at the world is the right way, through the worldview of Jesus Christ and the Bible, then we should want to have the best arguments possible for that. Our views, our arguments should hold up to any scrutiny that could come along, and we shouldn't be afraid of having a conversation with somebody that we wholeheartedly disagree with. So, and also, like, I think that Zoltan and I proved, you can take two people who fundamentally disagree on everything, pretty much everything. Now, of course, there are a few things we did agree on, but fundamentally different worldviews. You can have two people, and it doesn't have to be an argument. It doesn't have to be a personal attack. It doesn't have to be anything like that. It can just be a good conversation, a good exchange of ideas and thoughts, and hopefully both parties come away a little less ignorant than they were before. I certainly feel like I understand a little bit more where Zoltan's coming from. Again, not that I agree with it, because I don't, but I understand it a little bit better, and I'm hoping that through that type of understanding, it'll help me craft some better arguments in the future as well. And I'm hoping that it helps that for all of you too. So all that being said, another long-winded explanation of the interview, but I didn't want it to come across that I did this interview for shock value or anything like that, or for the controversy or for the debate. Had nothing to do with that. I did the interview because I genuinely want my Christian audience here on Into the Multiverse and the broader Christian church to be able to have access to the best arguments possible to explain and support your own faith. To explain, like, how would you explain to a transhumanist why Jesus is the answer and not trying to get rid of death through technology or something like that. And there are answers to those questions. I think we as Christians can benefit a lot from that, actually. If we were more willing to hear arguments from atheists. Now, I know there's a lot of emotional atheists and a lot of people that deal with it emotionally, and it's hard to listen to because you can't create a logical argument against an emotion. But when you have somebody who can keep the emotion out of it and just tell you plainly what they feel and why, and lead you along a chain of their logic and reason, then we get the opportunity to do the same thing, and that could actually help sharpen our arguments. So that's why I wanted to do that interview. And again, a big thank you goes out to Zoltan for taking the time. I'm sure it's probably not the easiest thing in the world for someone in his position to come on a Christian show, but a big thank you goes out to him. So I hope this interview has helped, and I want to thank all of you. Please leave me a comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have arguments that I didn't think of, and if you're a transhumanist that happens to be watching the show, welcome to the show. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave your feedback as well. But I just want to thank all of you for watching, and until next time, take care and God bless.
With all the talk in media today about women's rights to be heard and treated with fairness and decency in all public platforms, Donna Howell's timely new book boldly establishes how it was Jesus Christ himself that settled this issue a long time ago. And at a time when it would have been considered revolutionary and prophetic. Bible scholars know that Jesus, while recognizing appropriate gender roles, intentionally began the first women's empowerment movement. But why did he do that? The answer to that mystery is in the Bible itself. Now, in one of the most talked about new releases of the year, The Handmaid's Conspiracy by best-selling author Donna Howell. The permanent changes Jesus made regarding women's rights, their value, and their role in delivering his message to the world is brought to light.
And if God decides to raise up a radical, he only needs one voice for an entire Great Awakening, and it could be yours.
This is Reverend Donna Howell.
Once you read The Handmaid's Conspiracy, you'll never think about the church that Jesus Christ started and that his apostles decreed in the same way again. The Handmaid's Conspiracy, available March 1st at skywatchtv.com.
Follow the cultural and historic backdrop behind Paul's words in the New Testament that correct the record on some of the most misinterpreted scriptures in modern history in relation to the issue of women, their leadership role in the church, and understand properly what Paul was responding to when the epistles were written. Skywatch TV is proud to announce one of the most anticipated, talked about new releases of the year, The Handmaiden's Conspiracy promotional offer. When you order The Handmaiden's Conspiracy from Skywatch TV, you'll receive Skywatch TV's brand new, beautifully bound, limited edition red letter King James Version of the Holy Bible with Apocrypha. In addition to the Old and New Testaments, this never-before-released, one-of-a-kind deluxe collector's Bible includes the ancient apocryphal books like Enoch, Jubilees, and 15 more ancient texts that the disciples of Christ read and quoted from. This gorgeous, limited edition Bible is available exclusively from Skywatch TV and holds a retail value of $80. Yours absolutely free for a limited time. That's right, absolutely free when you purchase the Handmaiden's Conspiracy promotional offer. Also included in this once-in-a-lifetime offer is the Donna Howell collection that includes all three of her runaway best-selling works, Radicals, Redeemed Unredeemable, and Final Fire. Sold separately, this unprecedented promotional offer retails for $160. Yours now for only $29.95 plus shipping and handling. This is one of the most exciting promotional offers we've made available, and you don't want to miss this opportunity to receive all four of best-selling author Donna Howell's works, along with the remarkable deluxe collector's King James Version of the Bible that includes the ancient apocryphal books of Enoch, Jubilees, and 15 more ancient texts. In fact, order numerous sets to give away to every Bible enthusiast and student you know. The Handmaiden's Conspiracy promotional offer. Order now at the Skywatch TV store or call 1-844-750-4985.